Okay, good morning. Today we are going to talk about the capital accumulation process in Marx. And first I'm going to talk about some methodological issues regarding capital accumulation process, both in the classical political economy and the Marxist political economy. They are more or less the same actually. And then I'm going to go into detail. Okay, let's begin with the working of capitalism in general from a methodological perspective. Okay, let me share this. Where are you? My God, why I can't find it. Okay, let's try again. Yes, it's here. Okay, I think we can start with this about the working of capitalism in the history of economic thought. Of course, there are some theses. One is the idea of historicity. Historicity means that history does matter. That's the basic claim. You know, you should consider the importance of history. What I'm saying is actually there are two aspects of human history in this regard. The general aspects of human history, independent of specific historical epochs, so to speak, historical periods. We can talk about the general structure of human history as in the historical materialist position of Marxists. And the other is the historically specific aspects of human history. You know, it depends on different places and different times, in different modes of production, for example, from Marxian perspective. We may have different modes of behavior of human beings, for example. You know, under capitalism, human beings are forced to behave as homo economicus. You know, they are concerned with their self-interest and try to maximize their utility, benefits, profit, etc. So this mode of behavior is not generally encountered within pre-capitalist modes of production, such as feudalism or the ancient civilization, you know, slavery, etc. So Marx is very careful about this, and he criticizes the classical political economy, especially Smith and Ricardo, exactly with this. You know, he argues that both Smith and Ricardo did not see this distinction between what is historically general and what is historically specific. He argues that their subject, their human anthropology, so to speak, depends on their times, you know, the beginning of the industrial capitalism, etc. What he says is simply that the human being they conceptualize is a human being that is behaving rationally in our own language in recent times, of course. He says that basically human beings are not like homo economicus. You know, there are different types of behavior, different types of historical, social institutions, depending on the specific mode of production in which people, human beings, live. So human conduct is based upon historically specific aspects, in addition to the historically general aspects. So basically, as to the general aspects of human history, the idea of the historical materialism is about what is most common in the human history, you know, the idea of the interaction between the economic base and the superstructure, is a general aspect of human history. You can encounter this in all modes of behavior, modes of production throughout the human history. So we can identify the economic base, which includes, of course, forces of production and relations of production. And this economic base is to determine the superstructure, ideological, etc. We have talked about this. But as to the specific aspects of capitalism, human history, we should distinguish between these two notions, human essence, for example, human nature in general, and human nature specifically we encounter in capitalism. Of course, there's a controversy regarding this, whether Marx has a frozen idea of human essence, which cannot change throughout history. If you look at his earlier work, for example, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, you can see that human beings are the same throughout human history. You know, they are species being in his philosophy, and they try to realize their own potentialities. This is basically an Aristotelian notion. Our aim in life is to reach a good life, in the sense that we all try to realize our own potentialities. So this is the general aspect of human history. So human beings are always the same. But on the other hand, when we talk about capitalism, we can identify some specific types of behavior of human beings, such as the Homo economicus type behavior, as we have already said. So this is an important aspect, in the on the Jewish question article, for example, written in his earlier period. Again, Marx argues that in capitalism, because of the social structure or institutional structure, we have two spheres of the society. One is the economic, the other is the political. Political basically means social. Within the political spheres, we act like Aristotelian beings, try to realize our own potentialities, try to affirm our own connectedness with fellow human beings. We have relatives, we have other human beings that we try to connect with, etc. But on the other hand, within the economic sphere, which is the sphere of the market, within the market sphere, we are acting like self-sufficient monads in this language, which means that we are basically act like atoms. We are all concerned with our own individual self-interest. We are forced to maximize our utility, etc. Just like the utilitarian thing. So we have under capitalism two different modes of behavior, so to speak. One is the Aristotelian one, which is concerned with realization of human potential in general, and the other is utilitarian one, so to speak. So this is the difference of capitalism. On the other hand, again, as regard to the specific aspects of capitalism, of course, the distinguishing characteristic of capitalism is that under capitalism, human beings, human labor power is treated to or is reduced to a commodity. Human labor power, which actually refers to the some of the human potentials in general, both physical and mental capacities, capabilities, etc. But under capitalism, human labor power, human transformative power, in other words, is transformed into a commodity that is bought and sold in the market. So this is the distinguishing characteristic of capitalism. And in order for this to happen, Marx argues that human beings must free in a double sense. One is that they have the freedom of making contracts. Freedom of contract is an essential feature of capitalism or market society in general. And the other condition is that human beings are free from the means of production. They don't have any kinds of means of production. Not all of human beings we are talking about, of course. Some of them do not own any kind of means of production, so they are forced to sell their own labor power. This is the idea of Marx. The distinguishing characteristic of capitalism is human labor power becoming a commodity. In pre-capitalist societies, of course, there were commodities, but human labor power itself was not a kind of commodity. According to Marx, in this, as we have talked before, Marx's idea is similar to that of Polanyi's, who argues that under capitalism, some fictitious commodities, 3 to be exact, fictitious commodities, are created in capitalism: labor, land, and money. So within Marx, we have the same idea, more or less. Of course, Marx is before Polanyi. Okay, so labor power is becoming a commodity is a distinguishing characteristic of capitalism. So under capitalism, human beings enter into capital wage labor relationship. Political economy is about social relations. And human beings are transformed into bearers of commodities, including human labor power. Labor power is a commodity. So human beings are forced to sell their own labor power. And this idea is as in the famous theory of alienation, and later in Das Kapital, the theory of commodity fetishism, both are the same, by the way. Human beings, the relations among human beings are transformed into relations among things, commodities. And also human labor power becomes a commodity. So it is treated like a thing, basically. This process is called by Georg Lukács as reification. Human beings and their relations are becoming things and relations among things, basically, other than relations among human beings. Human beings are forced to become the bearers of commodities. That also includes, of course, their own labor power, their own making a difference, their own power of agency, etc. So we sell our own labor power, and in return, we get wage and other types of income. We spend and we survive, etc. We all know this story. Okay, so this first distinction is important, historically specific and historically general aspects of human existence in general. So history, in that sense, does matter. So as we look at human history in Marx, historical materialism, of course, we are talking about. In Marx, human history can be understood as displaying 2 antinomical, 2 contradictory tendencies at once. One tendency is the human self-expression through creative action. This is the labor process that Marx calls in the 1844 manuscripts. Human beings try to realize our own potentialities, and they express their own essences into the nature. This is a Hegelian theme, or the, generally speaking, expressivist theme of the German Enlightenment tradition in general. So Marx has the same idea. We try to transform nature, and through this transformation process, we also transform ourselves. So we create ourselves in a sense. So human self-expression, we express ourselves, our own essences, our own nature, what is really being human, which means our own potentialities. And this process is called by Marx as objectification, as we remember. And the other tendency, which is in contradiction with the first, is the loss of freedom. Loss of freedom means basically alienation. Remember in Marx, in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the 2 processes the process of alienation and the process of objectification are two different and contradictory processes. Everything we do is basically aimed at self-realization, achieving self-consciousness, etc. But at the same time, depending on the historically specific aspect of human existence, it may become a form of alienation as well. In what societies are we talking about? Alienation occurs in the societies in which means of production are owned by private persons, private people. Private property, I'm talking about. Private property is a way of separating human beings from their own productive activity, from their own objectification process. So what we create is actually reflecting our own essence, but due to the private property, what we create in general are separated from us and becomes a commodity. So under capitalism, of course, it is the highest form of this alienation because under capitalism, the labor power itself becomes a commodity. So this is an important aspect. So when there is private property, we will have actually this alienation and commodification, and therefore commodity fictions will be coming as some alien entities that will control our own lives. So we have two different tendencies, even under capitalism. What we do in general are directed to realize our own essences, try to express ourselves, etc. But at the same time, because of the fact that market actually transforms everything into a commodity, what we create becomes an alien entity, a commodity, so become a fetish object, and these objects will control our own lives. So this is an important aspect of human existence throughout human history and under capitalism, of course. And also this idea of rationalization is basically used by Max Weber to explain capitalism, the working of capitalism. Capitalism is based upon this rationalization, rationalization in the sense of means ends rationality, Homo economicus think. And on the basis of this, human beings are forced to behave as Homo economicus, so they are imprisoned, so to speak, in an iron cage. This term also is Max Weber's term to explain the working of capitalism. Under capitalism, he says in his famous book, Protestant Etiquette, Capitalism, something like that. In the last pages, he argues that human beings try to, he talks about Protestantism in general. So according to him, Protestantism, Calvinism actually, in his book, he talks about, under Calvinism, the doctrine of calling, vocation, actually, is important. So it's a way of expressing for human beings, of course, expressing their own essences so that they try to reach God. You may never know that God actually forgives you or not, but if you are successful enough in your own business, for example, it may be an indirect measure, indirect feeling that God actually loves you, something like that. Of course, it's a very crude presentation of his ideas, whether they are true or not, but his idea is that, human beings, Protestants in general, try to show how good Christians they are, but in the end, they are to be prisoners of their own businesses. They try to get rich, they try to work harder and harder, but this actually becomes a prison. It's a kind of iron cage which actually limits human behavior in general and human human activity towards self-realization, etc. This idea is also occurring in Marx. We can say he doesn't specifically talk about the process of rationalization and identity, etc. But the idea is here, the process of commodity fetishism is more or less similar, if not the same, but similar to the process of rationalization and identity. So capitalism, according to Max Weber, is to be determined by this rational capital accounting. Double entry bookkeeping, for example, was introduced, sometime in the 15th century in Italy. And this is Lombard's view. So this accounting is very important for capitalist businesses because, it shows clearly your own activities and also your profits, etc. So it is the starting point of the rationalization of the whole process of businesses and production process in general. And later, with the advance of industrial capitalism, of course, this rationalization process becomes more and more limiting, strict in limiting human behavior in general, etc. So basically, but on the other hand, Marx also thinks that capitalism created some possibilities for us, for human beings, to develop our own potentials and also to realize our own potentials. What do I mean by this? Comparing to the pre-capitalist modes of production, we can say that under capitalism, human beings are freer, so to speak. They can enjoy greater freedom compared to other people under pre-capitalist formations in general, social formations of modes of production. So basically, under capitalism, our extent of freedom actually becomes greater. For example, under capitalism, individual freedom becomes an important value and virtue. We modern people, let's say, we'd like to consider ourselves as individuals in the first place, and we aspire freedom. Greater freedom is an important demand under capitalism, and the development of the notion of human rights and also democracy, historically speaking, of course, is also a product of capitalism. So under capitalism, as compared to slavery, for example, or even feudalism, human beings, we can say that, enjoy greater and greater freedom. But that's not the end of the story, according to Marx. At the same time, our own freedom is restricted by the market, the process of rationalization, alienation, the identification. Again, we have this contradictory process. On the one hand, we are enjoying greater freedom, but on the other hand, our freedom is lost at the same time. So Marx sees socialism, for example, as a way of realization of human freedom in its full extent, actually. So he cherishes, so to speak, liberal freedoms and so forth, but he argues that they are not enough. What's really needed is human self-realization in its full extent. We should become full-fledged individuals, human beings, so that we can realize our own potentials and we become free. So it's an aspiration of communism, of course. Anyway, so this idea of iron cage is important, the rationalization process created by capitalism in general. And also the third aspect, which is especially important, for the capital accumulation process under capitalism is the notion of self-destruction. This is an interesting theme, actually. It's very simple. The very success of capitalism is the basic cause of its failure. This is sometimes called as the rationalization towards being irrational. This idea can also be found in Schumpeter, for example. Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction refers to a similar process. Capitalism has been successful so far because it's based upon this process of innovation. Innovation means creation of new things, some novelties. It could be a new product, it could be a new method of production, it could be a new method of marketing, etc., etc. So the entrepreneur who introduces this innovation will get a higher profit. So capitalism is a dynamic process, dynamic mode of production, and its dynamism is based upon this capacity of producing innovations, but at the same time, in his famous book in 1921, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and he argues that capitalism comes to an end. It becomes more bureaucratic type of organization, which limits, which restricts the capacity of capitalism to produce innovations, etc. So this is a Weberian idea, and also we can say it's a kind of Nietzschean idea through Weber, of course. Weber's theory of charismatic individuality, for example, is an idea that is more or less derived from Nietzsche's philosophy, Nietzsche's Übermensch, superior men, human beings, whatever. So according to Schumpeter again, entrepreneurs are like those Übermensch. They have the capacity to create, to introduce novelty, etc. But this process will come to a halt because in time capitalism loses its dynamism because of the increasing bureaucratization process and rationalization, the iron cage process, in short. So the very success of capitalism will lead to a failure or a doom of capitalism itself. This is an interesting position, especially regarding the social and economic change and capital accumulation process. And this very same idea occurs in Marx as well, maybe even in Ricardo. In Ricardo, remember, capitalist accumulation process will come to an end because of the increasing share of rents. So greater portion of profits will be paid as rents to the landlords, and in the long run, there will be a stop of the capitalist accumulation process. So again, this is like capitalism creates some tendencies which will bring itself to an end, so to speak, or at least it will create some tendencies for destabilization and also crisis. The same idea occurs in Marx when we are going to talk about capitalist crises in Marx. We will again return to this issue, but from a methodological point of view, we can say that in general, in the history of economic thought, we may have two different positions regarding the working of capitalism and the capital accumulation process. And this is a famous distinction derived by Schumpeter again in his History of Economic Analysis book in 1954. And he distinguishes between two types of economic models that are devised to explain working of capitalism. general, or economic system in general. One is the what he calls hitchless models, and the other is hitchbound models. In the hitchless model is like the neoclassical model, actually. It's like an engine, like self-perpetuating engine, which was very popular during the Middle Ages. You can build a machine that works on the basis of its producing its own energy. When the machine works, it produces some energy, and this energy allows the machine to work, so it will work indefinitely without coming to any stop. It's a kind of myth, actually. It's not true. There was also a movie recently, right? Which is based upon this idea. Is this, there was this train going down and on, etc. I forgot its name. Anyway, so this is a kind of hitchless model. We build a model, we build a machine, which is capitalism, or the market system in general. So there's no problem in the working of this machine. It will go on and on continuously without coming to any stop. So this is the idea. Of course, there will be some frictions in the working of the system. There will be some problems, but all of these problems are external. They are not produced by the working of the machine itself. They are external in the sense that, for example, there will be some shocks. If there's a problem in the working of the markets, for example, this problem should be attributed to some outside sources, such as government interventions or some kind of technology shocks or some kind of oil shocks in the 1970s, for example, 1973, etc. So the problem will come from an outside source, not from the working of the system itself. But on the other hand, according to hitchbound models, the very working of the system, the very working of the machine will create some destabilizing tendencies. It will create some problems. The crisis theory is a case in point. And sooner or later, the machine will stop, not because of some external shocks or external disturbances or interventions, but because of the working of the machine itself. So there's no such thing as self-perpetuating mechanism in this case. You can find this idea in many theories of neoclassical school, and also from a macroeconomic perspective, we can have the same idea. Remember the theories of inflation, the classical theory of inflation, quantity theory, money, right? If there's a problem of inflation, this is because of the increases in money supply. Whenever the central bank increases money supply, there will be some kind of inflation. So it's coming from the central bank or some authority that lies outside the market. So the markets should leave their own devices. Whenever you intervene into the working of this mechanism, you will create some problem for the non-hitchless system. So basically, these systems, hitchless systems, are closed in the sense that Humean notions of causality applies. Whenever X, then Y. Whenever there's an increase in the demand supply, then there'll be an increase in the price level. Of course, this theory is based upon some very restricting assumptions, as we all know. So, ceteris paribus clausus, etc. So, but the closure of the system means exactly this. We try to close the system by limiting the relations among variables. The economy is a complex whole, actually, but instead of seeing as a kind of complex whole, we see it like a very simple machine, which works on basic, simple relations, mechanical relations. It's a mechanical system. So on the basis of this, we have a closed system, but, same causes will always create same effects, same results, according to this perspective. On the other hand, in the hedge-bound models, the system is open in the sense that same causes may create some different results in each time because of the complexity of the system. The notion of complexity is a recent and new idea in economics, and there are some important contributions, but in general, we can say that, for example, other than classical political economy, within the institutional school, for example, or reference, and also in the evolutionary economics, we have this notion of complexity. The systems are open, they are subject to change, the notion of non-empiricity, for example, according to Paul Davidson and Keynesian, post-Keynesian. We have the same idea even in Keynes as well. We can see that again, Keynes, we have this tendency for the crisis, or at least inequality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, etc. So it is the same idea. And the method is mostly static methods, time does not is considered as fixed. It's a static conception, as in the static equilibrium model, partial equilibrium model, of course. And on the other hand, in the evolutionary economics, for example, the method is more dynamic. This applies more or less to other heterodox schools, such as the institutional school or the classical political economy, etc. So the notion of order is spontaneous. We are talking about, of course, the invisible hand here, and the spontaneous orders of pi x, they are the same, actually. So this order is efficient. This is what we teach usually in economics departments throughout the world. Basically, we could leave the market system to its own devices. There will be general equilibrium, and this general equilibrium will be Pareto efficient at the same time, etc., etc. But on the other hand, in a hedge-bound system, the order is again a result of unintended consequences, maybe, but this order need not be efficient in the sense that it will create some general equilibrium and also some kind of efficiency and even a stable social order. There's no necessity for this. So there will be always changes, some elements of destruction of the system, again coming by its own, from its working, etc. So the source of instability of the system is internal in a hedge-bound system. And on the other hand, in the orthodox teaching, in general, in economics, we can say that the instabilities come from outside the system as government interventions, for example, or some existence of some frictions or some monopolistic tendencies, existence of trade unions, etc., etc. So if you look, according to Schumpeter, of course, this is an abstraction. It depends on the choice of the economists. Usually we are used that we start with some hitchless models and enter gradually some elements of instability so that we come up with a hedge-bound model. But in general, we can say that throughout the history of economics, we can distinguish between these two general positions between the hedge-bound models and the hitchless models, and Marxist model is definitely a kind of hitch hitchless, not a hitchless, I'm sorry, a hitch-bound model. So in general, if you look at, for example, the Marxian capital accumulation process, a schematic presentation can be seen something like this. Everything starts with exploitation of labor here, and oops, sorry, and okay, we are going to exploitation of labor, surplus value. Capitalism is based upon creating surplus value in general, and capital accumulation requires a positive rate of profit, and profit is the source of capital accumulation. But this exploitation of labor will create two tendencies at once, according to the Marxian position. One is the process of capital accumulation, increasing productivity, increasing production, and so forth. But at the same time, it will create some inadequate purchasing power, especially on the part of the laborers, workers in general, right? And on the one hand, it will create some declining rate of profit. This is a theory of crisis in Marx. And also it will bring about an increasing substitution of capital for labor. And this is an interesting aspect of Marx's process of capital accumulation. He equates this capital accumulation with increasing mechanization in the production process. This is understandable because, he was writing in 1860s, the Industrial Revolution is over, and England became the most important industrial power in the world. After 1860s, of course, other European nations start to develop their own industry, beginning with France and later Germany and so forth. So basically, for many economists at that time, capitalism is a kind of industrial capitalism, and it means increasing mechanization of the production process, which means basically substitution of capital and labor. So in Marx, for example, there's this interesting contradiction in this regard. I mean, not Marxist contradiction, but capital accumulation processes contradiction. As you increase the variable capital, wage payments, etc., if you increase labor in the production process, you will increase profit because you will have greater surplus value, right? The higher the variable capital, the greater surplus value and therefore profit. But at the same time, mechanization increases labor productivity. So by using same amount of labor, you can create greater quantities of labor surplus value. Therefore, there's always a tendency within a capitalist competition process to increase mechanization. This aspect of capital accumulation process is first observed by Adam Smith, actually, in his famous discussion of the division of labor, which means more or less the process of increasing novelties and so forth. It's a Schumpeterian understanding almost. And these three economists, actually, Smith, Marx, and Schumpeter, are well aware of the importance of technological innovations and mechanization process in the development of capitalism. So this capitalist accumulation process will bring about substitution of capital to labor for labor, because capitalists are forced, because of the competition, are forced to decrease their own costs so that they will have greater profits, or at least greater share from the total output created, total value created within the economy. So capitalists competition process, pre-competition, is based upon seeking new opportunities for profit. And in order to do so, they are forced to introduce new machines and so forth. So on the one hand, there's a tendency for the variable capital to rise, but on the other hand, capitalists are also forced to introduce new machines and so forth. So the constant capital will increase. And according to Marx, interestingly, the increase in the constant capital will be greater than the rate of increase, I should say. In the constant capital will be greater than the rate of increase in the variable capital. So this is more or less allowed. This is one of the main reason, actually, it is the main reason for the profit rate to decline, actually. So here, again, we have this interdependency. New machinery will increase the organic composition of capital, and ceteris paribus, this will create a tendency for profit to decline. And these are, of course, will create capitalist crisis. We are going to talk about this process next week, I guess, or even this week. Anyway, okay, so this, according to Marx, this process of capital accumulation will create two important tendencies. One is the centralization of capital. This is called the law by Marx. Capital's accumulation process creates some monopolies, or at least monopolistic elements and so forth. And of course, we should be careful in here. We already talked about this, but maybe we should repeat it once again. Capital, in a classical political economy perspective, or the Marxian political economy perspective, we should distinguish between the monopolization or monopolistic element and competition itself. What I'm trying to say is simply that just because there are some monopolistic elements in the competition process does not necessarily mean that competition does not work. Simple, how competition is understood within the classical political economy perspective as the tendency for the profit rate to be equal among the sectors in the economy in the long run, of course. So Marxist or classical political economists' conception of competition does not rule out the existence of some monopolistic elements within the competition process. All we need is the creation of this tendency towards the equalization of profit rates across the sectors, even if there are monopolies or oligopolies, whatever, imperfectly competitive elements within this process. This does not rule out the possibility of the equalization of profit. So this should be kept in mind when we talk about the capitalist production process. But in time, Marx argues that capital will be owned by less and less number of capitalists because of the increasing capital accumulation process. On the other hand, capitalist accumulation process will create a reserve army of the unemployed or underclasses or lumpenproletariat. Because, increasing substitution of capital for labor will bring about the increase in the population, the surplus population, as he calls it, of the unemployed, because, the function, of this reserve army is to exert some pressure on wages, right? If there is a greater quantity of unemployment, wages will not increase, etc. So this will bring about some immiseration of the proletariat, increasing poverty of the proletariat, and the concentration of wealth among very few of people in the society, and this will maybe bring about some kind of social revolution. Of course, this presentation is a first approximation. Actually, it's a mechanical interpretation of Marx. Sometimes this is not this particular presentation, but this idea in general is called as automatic Marxism. There'll be capitalist accumulation process, and this process will create crises, and this crisis will intensify the class struggle, and the end of this class struggle with the social revolution, etc. It's not that simple, but at least as tendencies, we can use this particular diagram to understand the general capitalist accumulation process. Okay, maybe I think we should stop here for now and continue later.